Welcome, fellow seekers of truth, to our latest intellectual expedition. Today, we are diving deep into the ancient, dusty, and often misunderstood pages of Genesis. But hold on to your hats, because this isn't your Sunday school's Genesis.
Amen.
No, we are about to embark on a journey that will challenge everything you thought you knew about this seminal text. You see, Genesis isn't just a standalone story. It's a melting pot of ideas, a cultural crossroads where the Mesopotamian and Greek worlds collide. And it's in this collision where things get really interesting. Ever heard of Cain and Abel? Of course you have. But what if I told you their story echoes the Greek tales of murderous siblings, and those sons of God running around ruling territories and taking beautiful wives to create a race of giants? Sounds suspiciously like the Greek pantheon, doesn't it? And then there's the Garden of Eden, a paradise lost, bearing a striking resemblance to Plato's Atlantis. Let's not forget the flood, a cataclysmic event that's suspiciously universal across ancient cultures. But wait, there's more. Genesis 1:26 throws us a curveball with the gods and possibly goddesses declaring,
"Let us make man in our image, in our likeness."
And again, in Genesis 3:22, Yahweh tells the gods,
"Behold, the man has become like one of us."
So what's going on here? Is Genesis about one god or many gods? And where does Yahweh fit into this divine jigsaw puzzle? Well, buckle up, because we are about to find out. This is just the beginning of our deep dive into the origins of the Bible. So grab your archaeologist hat, your detective's magnifying glass, and your philosopher's curiosity, because we are about to embark on a journey that will change the way you see Genesis forever. Are you ready? I hope so, because the truth is often stranger than fiction, and in the case of Genesis, it's also a whole lot more fascinating. Let's get started. Today we are taking a detour from the well-worn path of Mesopotamian influences and venturing into the sun-drenched landscapes of ancient Greece. And who's our guide for this journey? None other than Russell Gmirkin, the author of a recent book that's been causing quite the stir in biblical circles. Now, Gmirkin isn't your average scholar. He's a bit of a maverick, a trailblazer who isn't afraid to challenge the status quo. And his latest theory? Well, it's a doozy. He argues that Genesis 1-11 isn't just a rehash of ancient Mesopotamian traditions like the flood story from the Epic of Gilgamesh. No, he's convinced that Genesis is also heavily influenced by Greek myths and traditions. And when I say Greek traditions, I'm not talking about olives and togas. I'm talking about the big guns, the heavy hitters of Greek philosophy and mythology. I'm talking about Plato. You see, Plato had a lot to say about the creation of the world and humankind. He spun tales of gods living among men, ruling over earthly kingdoms, taking wives and fathering lines of noble kings. That is, until Zeus, the king of the gods, decided to hit the reset button with a few well-placed earthquakes and a flood, Sound familiar? But Gamirkin doesn't stop at the flood. He goes on to argue that the sons of God mentioned in early Genesis are best understood in light of Plato's accounts of mythical times. According to Gamirkin, the twin creation accounts of Genesis 1 and 2 through 3 both draw extensively on the two-part story of creation in Plato's Timaeus. In this text, Plato first described the creation of a perfect world by an eternal, supreme God he called the demiurge or craftsman. This account, Gamirkin argues, closely resembles the creation story of Genesis 1. But here's the kicker. Everything the craftsman created was immortal and perfect, just like himself. So Plato had to come up with a second creation story to explain the existence of mortal, flawed humans. In this second story, the craftsman delegates the task of creating mortal life to his offspring, the traditional gods and goddesses of Greek myth. The earth is then divided up among these divine beings who create humans in various lands they rule over. But how can a god have a son or daughter? How can a new god come into existence? These lesser gods, these sons and daughters of the craftsman, are walking paradoxes. They have a birth or a generation at a specific point in the past, yet they possess eternal life, stretching forever into the future. This paradox, Gamirkin argues, is true not only of the Greek gods of Hesiod and Plato, but also of the biblical sons of God. And where does Yahweh fit into all of this? Well, according to Gamirkin, Yahweh was just one of these earthbound lesser gods, ruling over the land of Eden. He points out in Deuteronomy 32, 8-9, where Yahweh is but one of the many sons of the Most High God, assigned to rule over the children of Israel.
When Elyon gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated humanity, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of sons of God. For Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage. Deuteronomy 32, 8-9.
Now this might be a bit of a shock to those of us who've grown up with the idea of a single, all-powerful, monotheistic God. But Gamirkin argues that this is much later, almost modern religious idea that we are imposing on the biblical text. In the stories of Genesis, Yahweh is anything but grandiose. He resides not in eternal realms beyond the heavens, but in the earthly land of Eden, presumably in a temple or palace where he takes strolls in the garden in the coolness of the day to take in the pleasant fragrances. When Adam and Eve hide from him, he calls out,
"Where are you?"
And when they explain they were ashamed of their nakedness, Yahweh asks,
"Who told you you were naked?"
When interrogated, they blame it all on the serpent and confess to eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Clearly, Yahweh is anything but omniscient or omnipresent. So there you have it, folks. Genesis, the Greek edition. It's a theory that's sure to ruffle a few feathers, but that's what makes it so fun, right? It challenges us to look at Genesis in a new light, to question our assumptions, and to engage with the text in a deeper and more meaningful way. Let's get started. There's a lot more to explore in this Greek-infused version of Genesis, and I can't wait to see where this journey takes us. Cain and Abel. One sees virtually the same scene is repeated later on, after the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden. When Cain murders Abel, Yahweh questions Cain at the crime scene like a primordial policeman interrogating a suspect.
"Where is Abel? What have you done to him? His spilled blood cries out to me from the ground."
Cain finally breaks and confesses, but why was an interrogation necessary? And then what happens? Yahweh condemns Cain to wander the earth as a fugitive and vagabond.
And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and dwelt in the land of Nod, on the east of Eden.
What? Yahweh's presence only extends as far as the borders of the land of Eden? Later in the Bible, Jonah hopped a freighter and fled to distant Tarshish at the ends of the earth, but was unable to escape the presence of God in Jonah 1 verse 3. But in Genesis, Yahweh was anything but omniscient or omnipresent. He ruled only one tiny land where his subjects could occasionally meet him face to face. But the rest of the world was apparently the domain of other peoples ruled by other gods. Clearly, Adam and Eve and their murderous son Cain were not the only humans on earth at that time. For when Cain learns of his fate, he is desperately afraid of the people he will encounter.
I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond upon the earth, and whoever finds me will slay me.
How is that possible? If Cain was the only human residing beyond the boundaries of Eden, Yahweh calms Cain's fears by placing a sign on him, a mark of divine protection to prevent his murder in the course of his wanderings. And what is Cain's subsequent history in the lands of his exile? He takes a wife, has a son called Enoch, and builds a city that he names after his firstborn. Where did he find a wife? Who lived in the city of Enoch? Why did Cain need to establish a city for himself, his wife, and his only son Enoch? Why not just build a house? Biblical theologians and many scholars, assuming that Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel were the only humans on earth at that time, struggle mightily with these questions. Cain must have married one of Adam and Eve's daughters, his own sister, who hadn't been born yet, according to the biblical narrative? Seriously? Adam and Eve sent their daughter to the murderer Cain so he could commit incest with her? This is ridiculous, and it offends the moral sensibilities, and is certainly not mentioned in the biblical narrative. Yet Cain marrying his own sister is thought to be the only logical possibility. Theologians and scholars also proposed that Cain feared his own family would chase him into exile and murder him, although the biblical text says no such thing. Which family members? Adam murdering his own son? An unborn younger brother or sister tracking him down in exile with vengeance on their mind? And yet the text says Cain feared immediate vengeance would follow wherever he traveled from those dwelling in the lands of his exile. These are some of the links scholars and theologians go to on the assumption that Adam and Eve were the first and only humans. But it is perfectly clear the earth is already well populated in the time of Adam and Eve and Cain and poor Abel. During the 130 years before the birth of Abel's replacement, Seth, and the other sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. Outside Eden was a vast and scary world where cursed Cain would find a new life among strangers. The Greek origins of Cain and Abel. The first hint of Greek influence in the story of Cain and Abel is God's outburst.
The voice of your brother Abel's blood cries out to me from the earth.
In the Greek world, unlike the ancient Near East, spilled blood placed a curse on the land until the homicide was avenged. The murderer was fair game to be slain by anyone who could find him, and so the killer typically fled into voluntary exile to escape the reach of vengeful kinsmen. The spilled blood calling out for vengeance and Cain's flight from the land of Eden were story elements that would have been well understood in the Greek world. So too the presence of people in the lands to which Cain fled. According to Greek myths, the early world was divided up among the gods, each god given his own territory to rule, and typically creating the humans who dwelled there. Hephaestus and Athena created a race of humans at Athens, Poseidon another race in his island realm of Atlantis, the Spartans yet another race of earthborn people, warriors spring up from serpents' teeth, and so forth. The world of early Genesis, especially as seen in the story of Cain and Abel, is very Greek, with different peoples scattered in different lands across the earth. Nor are these the only Greek elements in the story of Cain and Abel. The Bible has a multitude of stories about sibling rivalries, the stories of Cain and Abel, of Jacob and Esau, of sisters Leah and Rachel, of Joseph and his 12 brothers. But this was also a common plot element in Greek stories, in several of which a brother murders a brother, as in the story of Cain and Abel. One such story is that of Romulus and Remus, the twins who founded the city of Rome, sons of Mars, the war god, and a human woman, a princess. The current king considered potential rivals who posed a threat to his rule, so he had them abandoned in the wilderness. But they were found and raised by wild wolves, and on adulthood, determined to found a new city and kingdom. In an argument over the location of their new capital, Romulus slew his brother Remus. The city they founded was none other than Rome, which Romulus populated with exiles from other cities. Sibling rivalry, fratricide, the founding of a city, exiles, all motifs found in the story of Cain and Abel, with which it is frequently compared. But in this story, Romulus, the murderer, was a hero, and Remus, the villain. And Romulus did not go into exile, but harbored exiles from other lands. Another such story is that of Polynices and Eteocles, the sons of Oedipus. When it is revealed that Oedipus has killed his own father and married his own mother, he resigns as the king of Thebes, and his twin sons appointed to jointly rule the kingdom, taking turns in alternate years. Eteocles takes the first turn, while Polynices withdrew to Argos, where he married the daughter of the king. But when it was his turn to rule, Eteocles refused to turn over the rule. In the subsequent fight over the throne, both sons kill each other, putting an end to the cursed line. The most striking parallel, however, is that of Atreus and Thyestes of the cursed line of King Pelops of Mycenae in the days before the Trojan War. Tantalus, the father of Pelops, had tried to serve his son for dinner to the gods, to see if they were as all-knowing as they claimed. The gods detected the ruse, reassembled Pelops, and brought him back to life, and cursed both Tantalus and his descendants for this act of impiety. Pelops later became king of Mycenae. Atreus and Thyestes were his sons by one wife and half-brother to Chrysippus, son to a second wife and the favorite son of Pelops. Hippodamia, the mother of Atreus and Thyestes, conspired with the two to murder Chrysippus. Blamed for his murder, the two were both forced into exile, like Cain. The story had many subsequent twists and turns. Thyestes briefly returned to Mycenae and became king. Atreus went mad in exile, murdered the sons of Thyestes, and served them to him at dinner, like their grandfather Tantalus. Atreus became king, and now Thyestes went into exile. Incest, rape, the murder of Atreus, and Thyestes ruled a third time in Mycenae, yet ultimately he wound up in exile a third time as well, dying on the island of Cythera. Here there are parallels galore. There is sibling rivalry, with brother murdering brother. There is the gods placing a curse of the line of Pelops, much as they had earlier cursed the line of Oedipus, like God cursing Cain and his wicked line of descendants. There is exile, which was a common Greek punishment for murder, wandering from one land to another. There are the hints that Cain is an exiled prince, establishing a city and kingdom in his land of exile, like the characters in virtually all of the Greek stories we have considered as parallels. The primordial world. According to Gamirkan, it is clear that Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, were by no means the only people on earth, not Yahweh the only God. The primordial world in the period before Noah's flood was instead exactly as described in Genesis 6, 1-4, with humans scattered far and wide across the face of the earth, and the sons of God living among them, taking wives from among the beautiful maidens dwelling in their various lands. This picture may offend our modern sensibilities. It certainly offended the authors of the Book of Enoch, who were reluctant to acknowledge the existence of any but the one supreme God. First, Enoch consequently demoted the sons of God to the status of lustful angels fallen from heaven, cohabiting with wicked and adulterous women, to whom they revealed all the forbidden arts, including those regarding makeup and jewelry.
And Azazel showed their chosen ones bracelets, decorations, shadowing the eye, with antimony, ornamentation, the beautifying of the eyelids, all kinds of precious stones, and all coloring tinctures and alchemy. And there were many wicked ones, and they committed adultery and erred, and all their conduct became corrupt. 1 Enoch 8, 1-2.
Their offspring likewise were condemned as an evil race of giants, but Genesis 6 clearly states that these were the sons of God, not angels, fallen or otherwise. They are not condemned for taking human wives. The wives are described as beautiful or good, the same word in both Hebrew and Greek, as used repeatedly throughout Genesis 1 to describe the beautiful, good creation. Nor are the Nephilim, or giants, condemned in Genesis 6:4. Instead, they are called mighty, men of name, or men of renown, a race of heroes, the same sort of half-human, half-divine beings the Greeks called demigods. Far from being condemned, Genesis 6 appears to view favorably the sons of God, their beautiful, goodly wives, and their heroic offspring. According to Gamirkan, we must see Genesis through new eyes, not conditioned by traditional interpretations. Whence the sons of God? Where did these stories of the sons of God, of beautiful women, of heroic races of demigods come from? Not from the ancient Near East, according to Gamirkan, but from Plato, and specifically from Plato's story of Atlantis, which contains many striking thematic parallels to the stories in early Genesis. Plato told his story of Atlantis in two dialogues, in Timaeus, which the biblical author appeared to have directly drawn on in the twin creation accounts of Genesis 1-3, and in Critias, a companion piece that described the wonderful realm of Atlantis in fantastic detail. It is thus natural that the biblical authors would have been familiar with both of these Platonic texts. The Garden of Eden and Mesopotamian parallels. According to Gamirkan, One already sees echoes of Plato's Atlantis in the biblical description of the Garden of Eden. Biblical scholars have long struggled to find a convincing prototype for the Garden of Eden in the ancient Near East, but to no avail. Gamirkin discusses the four major theories on the Mesopotamian origins of the Garden of Eden and the reasons why scholars reject them all. Number one, temple gardens of the ancient Near East existed primarily for economic purposes to support the temple, its offerings, and its personnel. Temple gardens were not known for their variety of plants, nor for their animals. Such gardens did not possess a cosmic or mythic dimension and were not associated with primordial times. 2. Royal parks attached to palaces such as those created by Ashurbanipal, Esarhaddon, Merodach-Baladan II, Nebuchadnezzar, and various Persian kings are an attractive possibility in terms of their profusion of exotic plants. Ancient Near Eastern kings such as Tiglath-Pileser III, Ashurbanipal, and Sennacherib were also known for their collecting exotic wild animals placed in hunting parks where kings most famously hunted and slew lions. But such royal parks have properly been discounted as convincing parallels due to their strictly historical character without any mythical dimension. And why would a king's hunting park become the model or paradigm of the garden of the gods in the primordial world? 3. The search for Mesopotamian mythical stories featuring gardens in primordial times often centers on the Gilgamesh epic, which is set after the flood of Utnapishtim. Gilgamesh and Enkidu had one adventure in the cedar forest located according to various traditions either in the Zagros Mountains or Mount Lebanon, where they slew the monster Huwawa and felled 7 sacred cedar trees. But rivers do not feature in this story, nor did the cedar forest contain a profusion of plants or animals, nor was it a divine abode. Gilgamesh, in his quest for immortality, later traveled through a jeweled garden, a mythical location at the edge of the world, approaching the dwelling of the flood hero Utnapishtim, but there are no hints of a divine presence in the jeweled garden, nor indeed earthly plants or animals. The story of Utnapishtim itself, though part of a quest for immortality, featured no plants or garden. Number 4. Another myth, the Sumerian story of Enki and Ninhursag, has been compared to the story of the Garden of Eden, but the setting better corresponds to Genesis 2:4-5, at the creation of the heavens and the earth, when the land was arid and before the appearance of the first humans. The tale is populated exclusively by the gods and centers on Enki bringing up subterranean waters, sexually fructifying the land so it produces the first plants, and the origin of sex among the gods. The parallels with Genesis are slight, if any. In summary, the various attempts to find Mesopotamian parallels to the Garden of Eden itself have all proved highly problematic on close inspection. The search for comparative examples from ancient Mesopotamia, to the exclusion of Greek comparative materials, was largely premised on the assumed antiquity of the Garden of Eden story. The recognition that this story may have dated as late as the early Hellenistic era, along with the rest of the Pentateuch, opens up new possibilities for comparative study. The pervasive Platonic influences in Genesis 1-3 suggest Plato's writings might provide the literary background of the description of the Garden of Eden. Gamirkin suggests that instead of the ancient Near East, Greek literature might provide a more convincing literary prototype for the Garden of Eden. In specific, he points out the extensive parallels between the Garden of Eden and Plato's utopian imaginary continent of Atlantis. The Garden of Eden and Greek parallels to Plato's Timaeus and Critias. Let's peek into Plato's Critias to see how it compares with Genesis. And keep in mind, everything we discuss about Atlantis is sourced in Critias. However, I recommend you get Russell Gamirkin's book, which spells out everything with extensive footnotes to argue his case. One may first point to a similar temporal and mythological setting, with the terrestrial deity Poseidon, one of the generated gods who were offspring of the demiurge, Crafter, dwelling in his allotted land with the first generation of earthborn humans. Poseidon's allotment was the island of Atlantis, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that is, the Straits of Gibraltar, together with the Libyan or African coast as far as Egypt and the European lands as far as Tuscany. But within this vast western realm, Poseidon chose Atlantis as the fairest locale. It was there that he situated his palace and temple. Plato, in the person of Critias, gave an extensive detailed geographical description of the region, of the island of Atlantis, and of the dwelling place of Poseidon. Poseidon dwelled with his mortal wife Plato in a temple constructed on a low mountain that gave rise to two springs, one hot, one cold. Streams came down from the mountains and circled the plains.
And the outflowing water they conducted to the sacred grove of Poseidon, which contained trees of all kinds that were of marvelous beauty and height because of the richness of the soil. Critias 117b.
This description directly compares with Genesis 2:10.
And a river goes forth from out of Eden to water the paradise.
The exotic realm of Atlantis was a fair and fertile land for a god to dwell at ease. It was filled with gardens and plantations of trees,
producing out of the earth all kinds of food in plenty. Critias 113.
Atlantis had forest full of timber and animals, both tame and wild. The ground held all sorts of metals to be mined, including
orichalcum, which sparked life like fire,
the most precious metal other than gold. Critias 114e. The fertile land of Atlantis had 2 harvest seasons a year, receiving rains from heaven. From the mention of cultivated plants and orchards and domesticated animals, it is apparent that the inhabitants of the land included agriculturalists and herders. Prominent in Atlantis were the gardens, with every type of fragrant tree, good for food and beautiful in appearance, as Plato eloquently described at Critias 115a to 117b.
In addition to all of this, it produced and brought to perfection all those sweet-scented stuffs which the earth produces now, whether made of roots or herbs or trees, or of liquid gums derived from flowers or fruits, the cultivated fruit also, and the dry which serves us for nutriment, and all the other kinds that we use for our meals, the various species of which are comprehended under the name vegetables, and in all the produce of the trees which affords liquid and solid food, and unguents, and the fruit of the orchard trees, so hard to store, which is grown for the sake of amusement and pleasure, and all the after-dinner fruits that we serve up as welcome remedies for the sufferer for repletion. All these that hallowed island, as it lay then beneath the sun, produced in marvelous beauty and endless abundance, and the outflowing water they conducted to the sacred grove of Poseidon, which contained trees of all kinds that were of marvelous beauty and height, because of the richness of the soil.
In this settlement of Poseidon, the Atlanteans also constructed over time magnificent temples for sacrifices at periodic gatherings of the divine kings descended from the god, and a city laid out with royal palaces, docks, and quarters for soldiers, built up over time until Atlantean arrogance brought on cataclysmic destruction by rain and flood and earthquake. Plato's extensive description of the primordial flood, when the terrestrial gods dwelled among humans, set the stage for his main story, the war between Athens and Atlantis, and the destruction of the world by flood. From the above survey, it should now be apparent that the beautiful Garden of Eden in Genesis 2 drew extensively on Plato's description of Atlantis and Critias, the sequel to Plato's Timaeus. The general mythological setting in a garden of the terrestrial gods in primordial times resonates with Plato's extensive description of Poseidon's earthly realm. Atlantis and Genesis. The parallels become even more striking when we come to the story of the sons of God in Genesis 6. In Critias, Plato claims that when the earth was divided up among the gods, the land of Atlantis fell to Poseidon, the god of seas and storms and earthquakes. Poseidon dwelt in a magnificent temple on a low mountain in Atlantis, surrounded by streams and gardens. Also living in Atlantis was a fair maiden of marriageable age named Plato, whom Poseidon took to wife, fathering 10 sons, 5 pairs of twins, the first human rulers of Atlantis. The eldest was Atlas, portrayed as a giant in Greek myth, who gave his name to Atlantis, as well as the Atlantic Ocean and Atlas Mountains in northwest Africa. Hercules was also another well-known Greek hero of gigantic stature, owing to having a human for a mother and a god for a father, Zeus. The 10 kings of Atlantis at first ruled peaceably over their respective territories in divine wisdom and justice, as befitted their nature. But generation by generation, as they took on human wives, the divine element was diluted over time, and the human element began to dominate with all its unruly passions, ambitions, and violence. The kings of Atlantis finally conceived a thoroughly greedy and wicked scheme to assemble their fleets in an unprovoked naval assault on the countries inside the Gibraltar Straits, putting the entire Mediterranean world under their unjust rule. The noble Athenians themselves, descendants of the gods, heroically led the battle against them. Finally, Zeus himself intervened, sending earthquakes, rain, and flood, just like in the biblical flood story, that sank Atlantis beneath the waves and incidentally destroyed Athens and many other lands as well, so that civilization could have a new start. Some of these themes were seen in earlier Greek literature, notably Hesiod's Catalogue of Women, around 700 BCE, that spoke of marriages between the Greek gods and human women, as several prominent biblical scholars have noted. But Catalogue of the Women didn't speak of the offspring of these marriages as giants, nor did the world end in a cataclysmic flood, as in Plato's story of Atlantis. Plato's story of Atlantis contains much better parallels. Like the story in Genesis, Plato's described a noble line of demigods, the descendants of Poseidon, who became corrupt through time, ending in such violence and injustice that the gods sent a world flood as punishment. Throughout the many flood stories of the ancient Near East and Greek worlds, not a single tale claimed the deluge was sent to punish human wickedness other than Noah's flood in Genesis 6-9 and Plato's story of Atlantis. Over 300 years later, a flood story by the Roman poet Ovid's Metamorphoses had similar ethical elements, but this was centuries too late to have influenced the biblical text. According to Gmirkin, the only viable candidate for a moralizing flood story featuring gods and beautiful women, demigods that descend into violence, and judgment in earthquake, rain, and flood, is Plato's Atlantis. Berossus and Gilgamesh. That is not to say that Gamirkan says the sources behind the Genesis flood story are 100% Greek. In an earlier book, Berossus and Genesis, he argued that a large part of the story came from Mesopotamian sources, in line with scholars of the past. For instance, it has long been recognized that the 10 long-lived generations before the flood in Genesis 4 through 5 appears to be based on the Sumerian king list, which had 10 kings lasting 430,000 years before the flood of Atrahasis. Similarly, many details of Noah's flood correspond with the flood of Atrahasis as described in the Gilgamesh epic, Tablet 11. But where did the biblical authors read about these ancient Mesopotamian traditions? Did they learn to read cuneiform, the curious script in which these tales were written in ancient Akkadian and Sumerian? Did they have access to the great library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, where Gilgamesh epic was to be found in the Akkadian language? Did the authors of Genesis learn ancient Sumerian, a dead language known in later centuries only to a few scribes in Assyria and Babylonia, so that they could read and copy the Sumerian king list? Did they have access to the temples and palace libraries of ancient Mesopotamia, where these texts were housed? Highly unlikely, says Gamirkan. Improbable, bordering on the ridiculous. Instead, they found all the relevant Mesopotamian sources conveniently collected together in one single literary text, written in Greek and easily available to the Jews of the early Hellenistic era. The Babylonica of Berossus, written around 280 BCE, of which at least one copy was certainly found in the Great Library of Alexandria, which historical tradition says was frequented by Jewish scholars not long afterwards. Berossus, a priest of the temple of Marduk in Babylon, had access to vast collections of ancient cuneiform texts, including creation accounts, flood accounts, and kings lists, from the dawn of time down to his own day, which he personally translated into Greek for the convenience of readers around the world who were curious about the glories of ancient Babylonia and its literature. What's more, his translations of these ancient texts are often closer to the biblical text than any surviving cuneiform text uncovered by archaeologists. For instance, various ancient copies of the Sumerian king list have either 7, 8, or 9 kings before the flood, but the version found in Berossus has 10 kings, exactly like the biblical account. The flood story in Berossus also has all the main features found in the Gilgamesh epic and in the biblical account, including the release of birds after the flood landed in the mountains of Armenia.
Kronos appeared to Kisithros in a dream and revealed that on the 15th of the month, Decius, humankind would be destroyed by a great flood. He was to build a boat and board it with his family and best friends. He was to provision it with food and also to take on board wild animals and birds and all four-footed animals. Then, when all was prepared, he was to make ready to sail. He did not stop working until the ship was built. Its length was 5 stades, and its breadth 2 stades. He boarded the finished ship, equipped for everything as he had been commanded, with his wife, children, and closest friends. After the waters of the great flood had come and quickly left, Kisithros freed several birds. They found neither food nor a place to rest, and they returned to the ship. After a few days, he set free some of the other birds, and they too came back to the ship, but they returned with claws covered with mud. Then later, for a third time, he set free some other birds, but they did not return to the ship. Berossus, Babylonica, fragment F4b.
And then there's Gilgamesh himself. Ancient Mesopotamian sources describe Gilgamesh as a giant, 2/3 god and 1/3 human. In that way, he is reminiscent of the gigantic offspring of the gods in Genesis 6, 1-4. Berossus is also known to have talked about Gilgamesh in the third generation after the flood, describing him as an early post-flood king of Babylon. Scholars have connected the fabled adventures of Gilgamesh with those of his Greek counterpart, Hercules, who was the gigantic offspring of Zeus and a mortal wife, and whose world travels were recounted in the legendary 12 Labors of Hercules. It is thought Hercules was influenced in part by the Gilgamesh epic. So there are various points of connections between early Genesis and Mesopotamian traditions, all by way of Berossus, writing in the convenient Greek in a single book that the biblical authors appear to have read. First and foremost are the 10 long-lived generations before the flood, from the version of the Sumerian king list known only from Berossus. Second, there's the flood story from the Gilgamesh epic, which Berossus conveniently translates into Greek. And then there is the gigantic half-divine Gilgamesh. The Bible locates heroic races of giants on both sides of the flood, and singles out Nimrod of Babylon in the third generation after the flood as one such hero. Berossus situated Gilgamesh at Babylon in the third after the flood, so an influence of the Gilgamesh legend on Nimrod appears possible. So much for the parallels, but Gamirkan also noted differences. And none of the Mesopotamian tales have entire races of gigantic heroes arising through the intermarriages between gods and humans before the flood, or their corruption and descent into violence and wickedness, causing the gods to punish them with a flood. In none of the Mesopotamian flood stories is there an ethical reason for extinguishing humankind in a flood. In fact, most versions say that the gods simply became irritated with humans because they were too noisy and kept the gods awake. These two motifs of the rise of a race of demigods before the flood and their corruption and punishment by the gods in earthquake and flood are exclusively Greek. Indeed, they are found in a single source, Plato's story of Atlantis. Yahweh and Genesis. The result of all this new research is that the earliest traditions in Genesis was steeped in polytheism. A supreme, eternal, monotheistic God only appears in the creation story of Genesis 1. Much as Plato's eternal philosopher's God creates the heavens and earth and then disappears from history, letting his sons and daughters create mortal life and rule the earth on his behalf. Starting with Genesis 2, the Creator disappears from Genesis, replaced by the terrestrial sons of God, each in their own allotted land. Yahweh is thus a minor god, one of the many sons of God, dwelling in his land of Eden, and much later given a temple in Jerusalem. Starting in the book of Exodus, the biblical text tries to promote Yahweh to a more cosmic stature, but in Genesis, Yahweh is almost human, apparently being immortal only by the virtue of access to the tree of life. As Gamirkan points out, a similar picture of Yahweh as an earthbound deity is seen throughout Genesis. This is especially well illustrated in the story in Genesis 18, when Yahweh and 3 angels, walking through the wilderness of Mamre, in the heat of the day, stop by Abraham's tent for lunch and conversation. Water is fetched to wash Yahweh's feet, and he is encouraged to rest under a nearby shady tree. Sarah fixes bread, a calf is slaughtered and cooked, butter and milk is fetched, and Yahweh and Abraham amicably discuss how many righteous citizens would save nearby Sodom and Gomorrah from divine destruction. Yahweh was not the supreme God of creation, but just another weary desert hiker with sore feet and a growling stomach. Such was the original biblical conception of the sons of God. Well, my fellow truth seekers, we've come to the end of our journey through the fascinating connections between Genesis and the ancient Greek mythology, on Atlantis, the Garden of Eden, Cain and Abel, the biblical flood. But before you go, let me leave you with a few parting thoughts. As we've seen, the influence of Greek myths and traditions on the Bible is a topic that deserves further exploration. From the sons of God to the flood, there are countless parallels between these two ancient traditions that are just waiting to be uncovered. For a deeper dive into the topics discussed, don't forget to secure a copy of Russell Gamirkan's illuminating book, a treasure trove of knowledge. So if you've enjoyed this deep dive into the origins of the Bible, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel, smash the bell like I said, it will make sure you're notified every time. Like and comment on these videos telling us exactly what was your favorite part. And consider joining our Patreon community. Your support will help us continue our research and video production and bring you even more fascinating insights into the world of ancient history and mythology. Stay tuned, as we will uncover even more surprising connections between the Bible and other ancient traditions. Until then, keep searching for the truth, my friends, and never stop exploring the mysteries of the past with a skeptical mind. Oh, and never forget, we are MythVision.